So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Pride Month event, LGBTQ Thought Leaders Between Worlds, a queer boy from the Valleys. And we are delighted to be joined by our special guest, Jeffrey Weeks, who you can see on screen. Lovely to see some familiar faces and some new faces, and we'll be starting in just a moment. I have some virtual housekeeping that I'd like to take you through before I hand over to Alan for some scene setting, starting with a short statement on respect and dignity. Everyone speaking at or attending an LSBU event, whether in person or virtually, should be treated with respect, dignity, and courtesy. LSBU operates in an environment built on equality, inclusion, and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback, and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating, and bringing communities together. LSBU does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour, including that potentially impacts or contradicts LSBU's reputation and values, will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any example of this behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. We want our events to be an enjoyable, safe, and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. Just to take you through the Zoom functionality, you'll notice that I've enabled closed captioning. We do that in the interest of inclusivity and accessibility, but if you do not wish to see the subtitles, you can hide them. So if you go to the CC Live Transcript button towards the bottom of the screen, you can choose to hide subtitles by clicking the little up arrow, and that will remove them. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the event. We love to see your thoughts and comments. If you are more comfortable popping a question in there, you can do so, and we'll have time for questions later. But we do encourage you to turn your camera on to ask a live question when the time is right. And to ask a live question, you can either raise your hand using the little reactions button towards the bottom of the screen, or you can simply turn your camera on and wave that you'd like to ask one. This is a very informal, friendly setting, so there's no need for formalities. I'll be around to help with questions. We'd like to encourage you to share your thoughts and comments on Twitter, and I'll pop the hashtag and the Twitter handle in there. I think that's all from me. I'm in the background if you have any questions at all or need any support. And Alan, I'll hand over to you for our scene setting.
Brilliant, thanks Neil. Welcome to everyone tonight. Croeso I chi gyd heno, and happy Pride from London South Bank University. It is my very great pleasure to welcome everyone to join us for this very special book launch event as part of our LGBTQ plus Thought Leaders at LSBU series. What we're doing tonight is kind of doing a virtual launch, well, really doing a virtual launch of Jeffrey's memoir, Between Worlds, A Queer Boy from the Valleys. And it's been described as part autobiography, part social history, rich, entertaining, informative, and accessible storytelling. And I can attest to that, having read through it myself. It's a fantastic read. If you haven't got a copy yet, then you're in for a treat. Jeffrey Weeks has been described as the most significant British intellectual working on sexuality to emerge from the radical sexual movements of the 1970s. He was born in the Rhondda in 1945, moved to London in the 1970s, and began his long career as a researcher and writer on sexuality with widespread national and international recognition. He joined us at London South Bank University and was made professor of sociology in 1994. He led LSBU through a number of senior posts, and Jeffrey, you might correct me if I get any of these wrong. Head of school and Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences from 1995 to 2003, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Human Sciences from 2003 to 2007, University Head of Research from 2007 to 2008, and Research Professor from 2009 to 2013 when he was given the title Professor Emeritus. Jeffrey is the author, co-author, or editor of some 25 books and numerous articles, and his seminal book, Coming Out, A History of LGBT Movements and Identities Since the 19th Century, has been in print for 40 years. He was awarded the OBE and the Queen's Jubilee Honours in 2012 for his contribution to the social sciences. So again, welcome to everyone tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Croeso I chi gyd heno, min bleser mawr gyda Jeffrey Weeks.
Thanks very much, Alan, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all and to see friendly faces. It's a great honor to be invited to do this. What I'm going to do is offer a narrative about the book, why and how I came to write it, and interrupted by readings from the book. I hope in the end we get a sense of what the book is trying to do. Obviously, the readings are going to be very selective. We've got about 3/4 of an hour, I think. And I don't want to just sit and read the book. So feel free, if you want to interrupt, to ask me questions about any section I read or anything I say, indeed. But there will be an opportunity for questions at the end, I hope. So I'll try not to go on too long. But I thought I'd start by saying how I came to write the book, because it is connected in a way with my presence at London South Bank University itself. When I was appointed as Professor of Sociology, and in essence, it was a research post. And I thought, this is a wonderful opportunity. I could spend the rest of my life writing books. And it was the first opportunity I felt I'd had to have uninterrupted writing space. But of course, it didn't turn out quite like that, because the then Vice Chancellor, Jerry Birnbaum, wanted to reorganize some of the faculties, including the one I was in. And he asked me to apply for the head of school post. I said no. Then about a month later, he asked me again. And I said, no, that's not why I came here. And then I had to go to Mexico to give some lectures. And when I came back, he asked me for a third time. And it's very difficult to deny a Vice Chancellor 3 questions like that. So I allowed myself to apply. I said I would do it for 3 years, and then I'd like to go back to being a research professor. And he agreed, of course, and it was actually signed into my contract. Well, 3 years after that, there was another reorganization, and my school became a faculty. So I stayed on to get that going. And then we had a new Vice Chancellor who did another reorganization, dissolved all the faculties and recreated them. This time, he persuaded me to apply for the Executive Dean's role. So again, I found myself dragged into management and administration. The long and the short of this was, after 12 years of non-stop management, I felt I had an opportunity to ask for a favor from the Vice Chancellor. So I asked for a sabbatical, he granted it to me, much to my surprise, on condition I did certain other things as well. So I got a sabbatical in 2006-07. And my excuse why I needed the sabbatical was that I needed to do a book for the forthcoming research assessment exercise. And that went down quite well with him, and I got the sabbatical. And the book I wrote then was The World We Have Won, which is an account of changes in attitudes to sexuality from 1945, the year I was born, to the present. And as part of that, in the first chapter, I did a brief biographical sketch. And people seem to like this. And for some time afterwards, people asked me why I hadn't extended that into a full-scale memoir. And I thought over time, I brooded on it. And over time, I thought, well, perhaps I could do that. It would be a different style of writing, but it would give me an opportunity to look the other way round at the historical events I was exploring. The World We Have Won looked at shifts and changes at the macro level. So I thought, well, why not look at the micro level through the eyes of my own experience. Hence the idea for writing this memoir. It took me a long time to actually get around to writing it. It took even longer once I started to get going on the first chapter. It took me a year to write the first chapter. I found it such a difficult exercise, but it only took me a year to write the other 7. So that's the background. Now, if I could start by reading the beginning of the book, and I hope that'll make some sense of what the book is trying to do and how it got the title I gave it, Between Worlds. I was born on the 1st of November 1945 in the Rhondda, the most famous of the South Wales mining valleys. It was a birthplace that has marked and shaped me in ways that for a long time I did not really understand or fully accept. Because of my sexuality, I felt I had to escape its all-embracing intensity as soon as I could. But what my life became has always remained entwined with how my life began as a queer boy from the valleys. So I grew up in this terraced street overlooking the Lewis Merthyr colliery, which at one point was the largest in the world, in a very close, intense family. And I'm still close to those who've survived. My mother and father, of course, have since died. In many ways, I couldn't have asked for a more loving context in which to grow up. But there was a problem, and I'm reading now from the book. There was a problem that soon became obvious to everyone, especially my father, I suspect, though it was never fully vocalized, and one that was to shape my life. In a world where boys were boys and girls were girls, by the standards of the time and place, I was not quite either. I was bookish, not sporty. I preferred playing with girls rather than boys, and dolls rather than guns. When I was no longer allowed to play with dolls, I adopted a glove puppet with a sweet face and coached it in secret. I used my Meccano set to construct simple little houses and palaces rather than trains or pieces of machinery. I fantasized about imaginary kingdoms rather than model motor cars or football or rugby teams. I was horribly bullied by other boys and cried easily. I was slight, ginger-haired, couldn't roll my R's, couldn't whistle to save my life, and had a lisp. I never wanted to be a girl, but I felt a peculiar sort of little man. I was a classic sissy boy. The Rhondda I grew up in was a byword for community, for neighborliness, for warmth and mutual support. All this was true. The downside was that it was also a conservative, defensive, inward-looking culture. It bred intense local trust and strong social bonds, but also a prickly distrust of the wider world and an acute sensitivity to criticism, especially from insiders. The valleys not only had an iconic social, economic, cultural, and political history, which came to define what Darrell Leeworthy called Labour country, the heartland of radical social democracy that was not just about politics, but demarcated a way of life. They also had a distinctive sexual and family history, which was to shape me and my generation indelibly, even as we were swept up in wider historical shifts and moved into a wider world. The dust of that past is ingrained in my body and mind, like the coal residues that veined my grandfather's hands. I left the Rhondda just before my 19th birthday, and despite regular visits in the 50-odd years since, never lived there again. I moved into different worlds, became a different person, not despite, but in large part because of the love and support provided by my parents, and through the opportunities that as a bright grammar school boy in the post-1944 Education Act world, the social democracy of the Rhondda offered me. Yet as a queer boy from the Rhondda, I had to flee its intense embrace in order to become myself. What that self was or could be, I have spent a lifetime exploring. However much it felt like it at the time, it has not been a unique or singular journey. This book is a record, inevitably partial and fragmentary, of a personal journey, but also a social and cultural transformation that has remade the world I was born into and propelled me into different worlds. When my close friend and former partner, Angus Sutty, died in 1993 of AIDS-related illnesses, a friend wrote a note of condolence containing the thought that we're caught between worlds and ways of being. It resonated with me then and continues to echo now because it puts into words a sense of living in multiple worlds that coexisted side by side, but could rarely find the words to talk easily to one another. The AIDS crisis was one of a number of critical moments in my life that have dramatized both the resilience and impossibilities of traditions that were crumbling and the potentiality for fragility of new forms of living and loving that had yet to find full validation. This book is an attempt to make sense of the different worlds, ostensibly irreconcilable, but actually deeply imbricated, that I have lived in and between, and which have made me what I am today. So that's the background, what I tried to do in the book. And looking back at what I've written, although it wasn't always clear to me as I was writing it, that the book is in the end a love story, not only in the obvious sense of my intense relationships, but also of the place I came from and the people who loved me there, my family, and my parents and brothers particularly. So the book is in the end a long circular journey, I think, I hope, which takes me from where I was born, what I became, and how over what's now quite a long lifetime and quite a historically really significant shift into what I am today, and the belongings I have today. So it's about recognition, about reconciliation, about finding a way of living together despite all our differences and different hopes and aspirations. So that's the background. I'm happy to pause at that point and happy to go on. Shall I go on?
Feel free to, unless anyone has any questions. Does anyone have any questions for Jeffrey so far? Howard. You're just on mute. You're just on mute. You're just on mute there, Howard.
I started a gay group in Cardiff in 1971 called Cardiff Gay Liberation Front. Now, this was the first gay campaigning group set up in Wales, and I found it very difficult to attract people into it. We had great difficulty in advertising our meetings, so we drew upon a very small group of people that would come. And one person that came was from the Rhondda, and that was a girl, and she tried to commit suicide. She crashed her father's car. So there was a sort of, Cardiff was the capital, well, it wasn't the capital then, but well, it was the biggest city. So it did draw in people, but people in the valleys were very isolated, and they grew up in this nonconformist chapel atmosphere. The chapels were then decreasing in their importance, but the valleys were very isolated and somewhat hostile to new ideas. So I'm just wondering how Jeffrey found that, the environment that he grew up in that it was very, well, it wasn't welcoming to new ideas and new cultures. So I wonder how that affected him.
Before I answer that, just to say, I did in the mid-70s go to both the CHE and GLF meeting in Cardiff. So we may have met there a long time ago. What I say in the book is what I feel is that my school days were in words I found in James Baldwin, the usual grim nightmare. And that's how I felt it at the time. And I don't think time has eased my memory, because growing up queer, and I use that deliberately rather than gay for reasons I'll explain in a moment, was just really impossible, because there was such a gender divided culture. As I said in the introductory reading, little boys were little boys and little girls were little girls, and never the twain should meet, in effect. You lived in different social worlds. And for someone like me who preferred playing with my friend Linda down the street rather than the other butch boys in the street, I was marked at a very early age. And of course, I had no sense of what that marking meant at that point. I knew I was different, but how different? So if I could just read the next selection. I can't remember exactly when my amorphous feeling about being different firmed into a realization, that I had strong sexual attractions and desires for other males. From my mid-teens, however, I increasingly became aware that whatever the explanation of my peculiarity was, it separated me off from other boys and needed to be kept a deadly secret. I could scarcely give it a name, though others tried. I remember being asked loudly as I got onto a school bus, I must have been about 14, if I was a queer. Though I'd never heard the word in this context, I guessed what it must mean and muttered something self-mockingly. But I felt marked forever in front of the whole bus, and it seemed the whole world. The irony of this was that years later, I met by chance in London the guy, his name I remember was Terry, who had asked me the question. And of course, he turned out to be gay too, though tortured into middle age about coming out to his mother, who still lived in Porth, the town I came from. Words can be weapons, but they also help to give meaning to barely formed feelings. And I gradually learned through words my desires had a name, many names, which said something about me, what I was and could be. I picked up hints about what that might be from occasional insults or teasing questions, as from Terry, from snatches of information in newspapers, reports of court cases in the Rhondda Leader and Porth Gazette, oblique pieces in the columns of agony aunts in my mother's women's weeklies, even accounts of inversion and homosexuality in decrepit medical texts I found among the books of my long dead grandfather. Much of what I learned was still confined to my private thoughts and fantasies. I never experienced any sexual advances from adults. Perhaps I was too naive to notice them. Perhaps I was too unsporty and too poor a mixer to have regular extracurricular encounters with teachers, coaches, or scoutmasters. But I did learn to masturbate. I can't remember how. A school friend must have shown me. And my fantasies were increasingly of men, though I remained naive about what I was supposed to do with them for a long time. Eventually, I had brief and mainly unsatisfactory encounters with school friends, often starting with playing forfeits. And for several years, I had sexual fumblings with my friend Gavin, who lived up the street. We regularly met in his house on Friday evenings when his parents went to the club. They were not very fulfilling encounters. Gavin refused to kiss or undress, but they inflamed my imagination. Soon after I went to university, I came across James Baldwin's Another Country and thought it wonderful, life-changing. I copied out a few paragraphs in a letter to Gavin, hoping he would think them equally inspiring. A couple of days later, I got his reply. As I opened the envelope, the charred remains of my own letter fell out. That, the cover note said, was what he thought of my disgusting message. Next time I went home, I saw Gavin as usual, and we went for a drive, as if nothing had happened. As we stopped in a quiet road up the mountain, he grabbed me, and the usual messy groping followed. I was still desperate for physical contact, any contact, however unsatisfactory. So apparently was he. He later moved away, got married, had children, and cut any further contact with me. I've no idea what happened to him after that, but I suspect his was probably a more typical queer life at the time than mine was to become. I came to London as a student at University College London to read history. I also spent a large amount of time exploring what I could of the queer scene as it existed around me in London at the time. And gradually I built up a small network of friends. I knew where to go to pick people up. It was all very secretive. It was all completely detached from my college life. As far as I knew, there weren't any other queers in college with me, although of course there were, as I found out many years later, but none of us were prepared to come out. And the one guy in my year who I thought might be queer, I told that I was on a walk through Soho, looking at the sex signs and sex sites. And he vehemently denied to me that he was queer himself. Again, years later, he came out to me. All this time, when I thought I was the only one in my year, the only one in the university, he was also gay. But it took about 10 years after that. Subsequently, however, he became a stalwart of gay politics from the 70s onwards and is still active in local gay groups. Gradually, over time, things changed. Now, what I sought to do, being a sort of bookish boy, was learn about same-sex love, the queer world, as much from my reading as from doing it, at least for the first couple of years I was in London. And one way of doing that was by looking up in the library systematically every queer book I could find. There were no guides to it at that time. There was no obvious way of doing it. So I would go through the shelves alphabetically, looking at every book, trying to see any hint, whether novel or non-fiction, which would help me find myself. And in the book, I go through this at some length and the contacts I made. But the one writer I did discover almost immediately who inspired me was James Baldwin. And I write quite a bit in the book about that. I first encountered James Baldwin in my final year at school on a trip to Oxford to be interviewed for a college place. I was humiliated at the interview itself by my inarticulacy and by being told by the first upper-class academic I had ever met, who was also a baronet, that the handwriting on my entrance examination papers was ghastly, 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 ghastly. He asked me to rewrite a paper, obviously seeing some promise in me, but it did nothing to bolster my fragile self-confidence. I found solace, and indeed, as it turned out, life-changing inspiration in a novel I had bought in Blackwell's bookshop, Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. Like many queer novels of the time, this ended in death and apotheosis, but I found hope and inspiration in the description of same-sex love and the evocation of sexual passion, even if the exalted prose did not quite tell me what was actually going on when the central characters were having sex. I wept as I finished reading the book on the train back from Oxford, sure at last of my sexuality, if not of my university place. Giovanni's Room was the first novel dealing explicitly with homosexuality and same-sex love I had read. It was written by a Black American, and that immediately gave me a sense of the commonalities between being gay and being Black. Not similarities, but commonalities in many ways, and particularly of being an outsider, of being exiled, of feeling denied recognition. The epigraph of the book from Walt Whitman exploded in my mind then and remains with me all these years later. I am the man, I suffered, I was there. Okay. I'll now go on to say something about what it was like to be gay, for me anyway, in the mid-60s. This was a period when London was supposedly swinging. There was certainly some flinging going on. I was able, as I said earlier, to make contacts. I was able to have some sort of sex life, which wasn't particularly fulfilling. As I was discovering, it was very possible to have a full queer life in the London of the mid-60s, as long as you accepted its rules. But these rules were increasingly constraining for many in my generation. The city, the country were in a strange liminal place. The public rhetoric echoed with paeans to London's cutting-edge fashions, pop music, theatre and art, at the forefront of a country that was pushing towards a modern, hip Britain. Yet the roads there remained desperately narrow and tortuous if you were queer. Britain remained deeply entwined in coils of traditional attitudes and structures. Nostalgic memories today, especially from younger people, about the 60s, often celebrate the rise of soon-to-be famous queer artists and writers like David Hockney and the poet Tom Gunn. But I still found it difficult to forget that they preferred the sunshine and sexual freedom of sunny California to the restrictions of a grey London, whether swinging or not. The black humor and transgressive spirit of the young playwright Joe Orton was shaped in part by his encounters with the hypocrisies of old London, especially his imprisonment alongside his lover Kenneth Halliwell for wittily and erotically defacing Islington Library's books. But his Wildian eruption on the London scene was soon cut short by his murder by Halliwell. Like the heroes of many of the gay novels I was now reading, his glittering life also ended in tragedy. Years later, I used to give an annual lecture to sociology undergraduates at LSBU on the roots of the social and sexual revolutions since the 1960s. My students, the majority of whom were female, black, and often single mothers, would gasp with disbelief when I described what Britain was like in the 1950s and early 1960s. Suicide, I would say, was a criminal offence until 1962. So if you survived an attempt, you could be prosecuted and imprisoned. Even if you died, the families had to live with a sense of shame and guilt. I vividly remember my father inveighing bitterly against a poor neighbour who had gassed herself for her selfishness. Unmarried mothers, I would remind my students, were still regularly forced into mother and baby homes and compelled to give up their children for adoption. An unwanted pregnancy was still a desperate fear of my women friends in college. Despite the advent of the pill, access to it was restricted for single women until the late 1960s, and friends would go through contortions to get access. Abortion was illegal until 1967, and backstreet abortionists were a regular folk devil in the press and a reality in all too many women's lives. Meanwhile, male homosexuality was totally illegal, whether in public or private, and as I knew only too personally. The fact that my students were so surprised at any of these examples is a marker of how rapidly attitudes were to change in the next few decades. But while many of us hoped that the iceberg was at last beginning to crack, by the mid-1960s, its pace appeared truly glacial. 1967 was the year I graduated. It was the year of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which provided the soundtrack for that first summer of love. It was also the year when male homosexuality was partially decriminalized through the Hard-Won Sexual Offences Act. Like many of my generation, I was intoxicated by the music, the vibrancy, and new energy, though not at this stage by the drugs. But I was all too aware that I was still on the margins of all this excitement, and the 1967 Act did little to alleviate it. My life felt fundamentally compartmentalized and dishonest. The ending of a difficult emotional entanglement confirmed my sense that there was something deeply wrong with the way I lived. On my school teaching experiment, I'd become a school teacher in a grammar school in London, was turning out to be a major personal mistake. By the eve of my 25th birthday, in the autumn of 1970, I was ready for something new, though not yet sure what that would or could be. So we're now on the eve of the most important point of my life to that moment, which was the emergence of the gay liberation movement in London in 1970. We all know the stories, the myths about Stonewall the previous year in the United States, which had swept across large parts of America, certainly, and a bit more slowly to Europe and other parts of the world. I was in London at that point. I'd heard rumors of this mass movement in the United States. I was interested, but my overarching thought was this could never happen in Britain, not for years to come. But it did happen. In the autumn of 1970, the Gay Liberation Front held its first meeting in October 1970. And by chance, I was working in the same building, the London School of Economics, where that meeting took place. In fact, my room overlooked the building in which the meeting took place. And I'll read a bit about that. I had started a new job as a research assistant at the LSE at the beginning of October 1970, having fled my school teaching job as soon as I could. The school was a highly conservative boys' grammar school in deeply suburban London, where senior staff still wore gowns, and I was told by my head of department that becoming a member of the National Union of Teachers, which I did, was like joining a cell of the Communist Party. This did nothing to make me feel more confident or resilient as an inexperienced teacher faced by classes of unruly boys. I felt trapped and frustrated and started looking for a new job within a month of appointment. It took me a year to find something I wanted to do and that wanted me to do it. The job at LSE as a research assistant was a lifeline, but I had no idea when I started quite how significant my being there at that particular time would be. By contrast to the grammar school, LSE was then notorious for being radical and ungovernable, with regular student sit-ins and an intense bubbling among students and some staff of would-be revolutionary ideas. The tables in the canteen were always deep in leaflets about various left societies, revolutionary meetings and demos. A few weeks after I started, I picked up a notice about a meeting to set up a London version of GLF at LSD. I was working there on a very sober research project in the library, tracing the archives of prominent 20th century MPs, civil servants, military leaders, and public intellectuals, the quintessential political and social elite. And I knew pretty certainly that gay militancy might be a step too far for my bosses. Even though, of course, it eventually became clear that 3 out of 4 of our small research team were gay, as of course were many of our research subjects. So I was a little wary about going to the GLF meeting, but at the same time excited and desperate to find out more. I couldn't go to the first couple of meetings, but by early November, I was geared up. I went to a meeting at one of LSE's lecture theatres. It was intoxicating. For the first time in my life, I was in a room filled with scores of openly gay men and women of all ages, hippie and conventional, flamboyant and sober, femme and butch, white and some black, cis and trans, as we didn't then say, all apparently completely upfront and proud about their sexualities and gender diversities, and freely linking the fight for homosexual liberation to other radical political struggles, especially women's liberation and Black liberation. And I felt immediately that I had found a space that would be a political and sexual home. Within weeks, I had reinvented my entire way of being, with a new sexual identity, a new openness about my gayness, new friends, new ideas, new radical political commitments, a new lifestyle, a new home, and a new long-term lover, Angus Suttie. Between November 1970 and March 1971, when Angus and I moved into a new home with my old friend Mickey, my life was transformed. A fellow early GLFer, Alan Wakeman, in his memoir, Fragments of Joy and Sorrow, describes how he felt his soul came alive when he first heard of GLF. For me, less poetically, it was as if my whole being had exploded into 1,000 pieces and been refigured into a new form. And I finally came out publicly and irrevocably as gay. So the history of the next few years was a combination of intense political commitment, which culminated from the mid-70s onwards with my involvement with a gay socialist journal, Gay Left, and that took up for 5 years most of my energies, political energies, and my relationship with Angus at the same time, which was intense, extraordinarily intense, and which was in a sense wedded together in those first few years by our mutual involvement. Angus was a member of Gay Left alongside me. So a little on that. We fervently rejected the ideology of the monogamous couple, but found ourselves in a more or less monogamous relationship with its usual crop of passion, anxiety, and jealousies. The whole culture encouraged us to have open relationships, but the occasions when we tried invariably ended in tears and recriminations. We bought into the critique of the tyrannies of family life, which by its very nature excluded us. But we remained attached to our individual families of origin, despite the difficulties. We sought to create alternatives to the traditional family and ended up, in effect, creating an alternative type of family. We were, of course, living many contradictions, and our families did not help. Soon after Angus and I got together, we visited his brother Alan, who also lived in London, and came out to him. He got very angry, and we left with his words to Angus echoing behind us, that if he told their mother, Alan would kill us. When I came out to my father, not long after, in early 1972, he said he had suspected one of three things. I'd got a girl into trouble, I wanted to marry a black woman, or I was homosexual. It wasn't clear which he feared most. I never asked, largely because he had made it so clear that he didn't want to talk about it. Each of the options carried stigma and social embarrassment that he did not want to face. The large-scale battles that GLF confronted might be about abstracts such as capitalism, sexism, and patriarchy, but the real struggle against insult, rejection, and shame still had to be fought at the level of daily life, and how we lived was as important as what we did. I'll pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions, comments, thoughts.
Howard, I can see you have another question.
I'd like to echo Jeffrey's feelings about that first meeting of GLF that he went to at LSE, because I went to a GLF meeting at LSE as well in November of 1970. We could well have been at the same meeting, I don't know. But the atmosphere was electric, and you did really feel that you became alive and your identity was reinforced. And it was, I don't know, it was like going up into outer space. You just really felt a different person altogether, and you felt energized. And when you left that meeting, you really wanted to go home and start something up and do something to improve the situation for gay people. And you did realize that there were other people like yourself there who wanted to improve the situation. And it was a wonderful feeling. And I know when I got in the taxi to go to LSE, the taxi driver said to me, "Are you going to go join the revolution, are you?" Meaning I was going to go to LSE. And that's true. It was a hotbed of student reform, because students were complaining about all sorts of things at the university. But Jeffrey is quite right. You know, it was a tremendous atmosphere there at those meetings.
Thanks. Shall I go on?
Any other questions at all? No? Okay. Shaminda just popped in a chat, comment in the chat. I'm really enjoying listening to Jeffrey reading from his book, A Historical Record. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Louise, we have a question.
Hi, Jeffrey. Not sure if this is one that you can answer, but one of the things that I was aware of that lesbian women could share a flat together, obviously because that wasn't illegal, I think, in the same time frame. But I wondered whether men had difficulties with sharing a flat, and whether, you know, people kind of made assumptions on that during those sort of time frames.
It's a really interesting question, and you know, certainly there's many accounts of men having to pretend they were just lodging together, sharing a bed sitter, and lots of stories about how people would sleep in one bed but had to crumple up the other bed, so that the landlady wouldn't suspect. Of course, they always did. It's really interesting about women, because there's a long history, as you know, of relations between women, which who knows how emotionally intimate they were, or how sexually intimate, possibly not at all. But it was certainly accepted well into the 20th century that women could be companions, whereas two men as companions would be highly suspicious in some quarters, and might well attract the attention of the police. By the mid-60s, and especially if you're in a student ambience, things were changing because we all lived in bedsitter land. There was a shortage of housing, and it became quite acceptable that people would shack up together. And I never had any difficulty, actually, after I started living outside the student ambience, in sharing houses or flats. None at all, as far as I recall, except, of course, when members of the family came to visit. Then there was always a dilemma about what you did about the obviously shared bed, when there was only, 2 rooms, and the other room was occupied by someone else. But interestingly, when I first took Angus home, because my parents lived in a small house where I'd grown up, it was inevitable that Angus would have to share a bed with me, because that was the only bedroom available with a large double bed. So, housing circumstances often dictated to what degree things were accepted or were not accepted. But that wasn't the big problem for me. The problem was much more about how one reconciled the busy life I was developing in London as an activist by this time, and also beginning to write about sexuality, with the complex emotional relationships I had with my parents and family. Because my dad had made it clear he didn't want me to talk about it. He'd accept it because he loved me, but he didn't want to talk about it. And he certainly didn't want me to bring any shame on the family. So my ambition in getting involved in gay liberation was to break down the secret life, to smash the closet along with other people in gay liberation. And yet the way things developed was the two lives became much more separate, much less integrated. I lived a life in London, and I lived a life in South Wales when I visited there. And although my parents, well, certainly my mother, after my father died, met all my partners in various contexts, it was never talked about until quite late in life. And that seemed again something I'd failed to do given my commitment to the ideology of gay liberation. But as I've written about it, as I've worked on this book, I discovered it was pretty universal amongst people of my generation, where we were active and out in London. We were formally out in our home context, and yet certain things could be said and other things could be not said. I think now, actually, it wasn't just about gayness. I think the same happened about my brothers who straight, their private lives. No questions were ever asked unless there was a disaster. People were discreet. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to talk about certain things. And there was always a feeling that you had to have a respectable front. So what they didn't want was to bring shame on the neighborhood and on them. But also there was a sort of live and let live. What you don't know, you don't have to talk about. And it was don't talk, don't tell. That was a general ambience, I think, until quite late on in my life, despite the fact that by the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, I'd written umpteen books and articles on same-sex love and activities and sexuality in general. My family had copies of my books. It was never something we talked about. And the big breakthrough, as I describe in the book, came quite late on my 60th birthday, when for the first time all sides of the family, friends, colleagues, were gathered together, and that for the first time, I think, broke the barriers down. Excuse me. Could I just go on?
Sure.
The
Please
question?
continue.
Yeah.
Oh, Alan?
Yes. I've read your book, Jeffrey, and I've already expressed my feelings about it. But the point came to me when you're talking about being stigmatized and alienated. If that stigmatization was exclusively because you were gay, it has a certain resonance. But if the community had values that stigmatized other people who were not gay, but behaving in a way that's not acceptable to the community, does that actually modify your sense of being victim because you're gay? You are being victim of prejudice, and that prejudice discrimination is being shared by other people for different reasons who are not gay, but maybe having affairs or behaving in a way that the community doesn't accept. And we've already gathered from earlier on that there's a lot of fundamentalism, a lot of fundamental Protestantism, which is very puritanical and so on. So how do you feel about that?
Well, interestingly, I don't think the problem in the Rhondda was to do with religion. By the time I was growing up, certainly I came from a background which had been intensely religious. Both my grandfathers had been lay preachers, for instance.
That's what I was trying to make the point.
Yeah, but by my youth, my particular family, around my parents, was not religious at all, really. And we weren't brought up as religion. I had a little bout of religious mania myself when I was 17 or 18. And I used to pray every night that I wouldn't turn out to be queer, but the prayers weren't answered. And I soon lost interest in religion when I came to London as a student. But yes, as I said earlier on, the paradox of the Rhondda was it was an intensely warm, community-orientated, left-leaning culture with a long history of trade union militancy and so on. But the other side of that coin was this intense localism, this intense sense of community, the threat that outsiders posed, and the two went together. It was a cultural conservatism along with a political radicalism, and we know only too well that sort of mixture still exists. Not in the Rhondda, incidentally, or in South Wales, which I think is quite a different combination now. But that was certainly the case when I was growing up. But I think the core problem was, which made the area so culturally conservative and inward-looking, was this intense gender divide. It was a highly gendered society, partly shaped, obviously, by the fact it was overwhelmingly a mining area. And during the last century and this, women were overwhelmingly excluded from mining work. And the woman's task was to look after the house. The men's task was to go out and work, very heavy work, tough men's work, and different social worlds developed around that. Which is why I deliberately didn't describe my early life as a gay life. It was a queer life, because queer is sufficiently ambiguous to cover what I experienced. My first sense of difference was over being a sissy boy, not about having desire for other men. And it's the gender difference, the gender nonconformity, I think came first in my case. Now, obviously, in the history of my life, the two are inextricably linked. But certainly, in terms of my perception, in the early 60s, as I was going into my teens, the problem was my sissiness, not my sexuality. Okay, can I go on to say something about the way my career developed?
Of course.
I don't want to bore you with all the ins and outs of an up and down career, but I just wanted to say something about the way in which whatever jobs I did, whether teaching or administration or whatever, the core of my life since the 70s has been writing. In a sense, I did the other work in order to find time to write, or I tried to look for jobs which gave me the opportunity to write. And for me, this was always inextricably linked to the new sort of politics I found in the 1970s with gay liberation. I personally became increasingly preoccupied with writing about the movement, and movements we were caught up in 1972. Over the next few years, I began researching the origins of the homosexual emancipation movement itself and the ways in which this shaped and was shaped by the emerging gay identities. By the 1970s, such identities were becoming taken for granted and naturalized, but I was completely convinced they should better be seen as distinctly historical creations, products of language and ideas, as well as feelings and passions. I began to argue that the ways we thought and spoke about sexuality and how we labeled and categorized it were not simply descriptive or not neutral endeavors. They shaped and created ways of seeing the world, giving meaning to the amorphous desires and possibilities of the body. Words, speech, language made sexuality meaningful. Writing was a way of changing meanings and of making new possibilities and realities. And this was especially true of sexual identities. In the book, that goes into a long discussion of my writing and how I became a failed historian and later a successful sociologist. But rather than read a chunk out on that, I'll just briefly summarize it, because that first book, which was the book coming out about the emergence of the gay movements themselves, was published in 1977. It made my name as a writer about gay things and sexuality more generally, but also, at least temporarily, ruined my career, because I was trained as a historian. I'd written a history book. The book was well received, but no one wanted to employ me as a historian teacher. And over a prolonged period, over the next decade, I had to recreate myself as a sociologist. And eventually I became a professor of sociology at the University of the West of England and then at LSBU. And during my life since, I've co-identified as a historian and a sociologist, a historical sociologist or a sociological historian. More worlds that I had to negotiate. But it's really interesting now to reflect on that, because the historical profession was extremely conservative in the 1970s and 80s. It's much less so today. And the sociology profession was much more open to new ideas. It had its own ideological clashes. It had its own dogmatisms. And yet within it, there was space for someone like myself to find a niche. And I was certainly helped and supported in this by my friends Ken Plummer and Mary McIntosh, who were already making names for themselves as writers about homosexuality. And I went to the University of Essex in 1977, 78, to work with them. And after that, I got jobs in sociology departments, not history departments. And one of the piquant things about my life is that although I've spoken in many universities around the world, and not only in sociology departments, many conferences, I've never been invited to speak at my old university, University College London, as a historian. I've been at conferences there, but not organised by the history department. So there's something poignant to my mind about that, that I could never find a home in history, but I did find homes elsewhere. How much more time have I got, Neil Allen?
Alan, I'll come over to you.
Sorry, it takes me an extra second to unmute. Yeah, Jeffrey, we're kind of interspersing the questions with your talk, so I think rather than stick to the stop at 7 and answer questions, feel free to carry on if that's all right with the audience.
It's okay with me. So there's lots of things happened after the 1970s, and I certainly don't feel I'm locked in that historical period. I almost said hysterical period, and sometimes it felt hysterical. By the end of the 70s, though, there was a strong sense, I certainly had it, but I think the wider culture had it, that the era of revolutionary rhetoric, of liberationist ideals was coming to an end. And that was partly because of the exhaustion of those liberationist energies of the early 70s, partly because splits were developing, especially in the women's movement between radical feminism, socialist feminism, and so on. And partly, largely, because of the changing political climate. By the end of the 1970s, it was quite clear that the era of social democracy, which I benefited from, my generation had benefited from, was coming to an end. We were on the verge of the Thatcher Revolution, which dominated the 1980s, and of course beyond. But the other thing that happened, starting from 1981, of course, was the first of all a suspicion, and then the ghastly reality of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and the whole climate took a darker tone, and my writing shifted in the 1980s, as it had to, away from the celebration of new sexual freedoms to the recognition of the intransigencies of the culture, the difficulties of the culture, and also the way in which the new right politics of Thatcherism were deeply involved in the creation of the climate, which was having drastic effects on the people I knew, the people I identified with, the person I was, who were going through the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Now, one of the people who was deeply affected by this was my former lover, Angus. Angus and I had been, as I described earlier, had this intense relationship through the 1970s, but by the end of the 70s, things were beginning to go wrong. And by 1979, he had a new partner. I found this extremely difficult to deal with, but we went on living together and trying to cope with it, because we were deeply committed to this ideology that we weren't going to be jealous, we weren't going to be possessive, and so on. So we were committed to trying to make a friendship work, even if the lover relationship had come to an end. Angus's new lover was one of the first people in Britain to get HIV in 1983. Well, it began to manifest in 1983, and that brought home to us, obviously, the threat. I'd known about it in the abstract since I visited California in 1981, just as the first cases were being reported in the US. But for 2 years, it was something still over there and just a looming threat in Britain. By 1983, it had come home to us. And Jeff, Angus's partner, another Jeff, was obviously desperately ill, and he almost died several times. So within months, Jeff did die in early 1984. I think he was about the 20th person officially recorded as dying. But by that time, Angus himself had been diagnosed as having HIV. So I wanted to read just a few lines about that. Angus's life with AIDS exemplified for me the devastation wrought by the epidemic and the resilience of those struggling with it. The artist and filmmaker Derek Jarman once remarked sardonically, "You don't live with AIDS, you die of it." And for Derek, as for Angus, this was true. AIDS was still a death sentence, and they died within months of each other. If they had lived another 3 years, they would have benefited from the new triple combination drug therapies that transformed the life possibilities of many, many thousands and perhaps survived. As it was, Angus struggled with the various drugs then available to treat the range of opportunistic diseases, from TB to meningitis, that punished his body. Early on, he was prescribed AZT, one of several experimental therapies that never fulfilled their promise and had toxic effects. Angus had been devastated by Jeff Horton's death, and a few weeks after the funeral tried to take his own life. On that day, I was driving to Southampton, where I then worked, in torrential rain, and my car suddenly stopped on the motorway, the engine flooded with water. I had an instant feeling that something was wrong with Angus, and after a long day trying to contact him, we found him in time, unconscious but alive. Gradually, he returned to his pottery, and a year after Jeff's death, Angus had a solo exhibition of his pots. He was a well-known ceramicist, dedicated to Jeff's memory. This signaled a new burst of creativity with a distinctive new inflection in his works. By the early 90s, he had a growing international reputation. He also became an inspirational teacher and a fine writer. His was an engaged and committed life. Whatever he was doing, his courage, adventurous, and dedication to the possibility of his craft persisted. Through clay, Angus had found his voice and he made it sing. But by 1992, the struggle against frequent illnesses and growing frailty finally forced him to give up ceramics. My relationship with Angus had many ups and downs in the 22 years we knew each other, but I was always clear that whatever happened in our intimate entanglements, our friendship was a commitment to the end. With Mickey and Mark, my new partner, I helped care for him during his final illnesses, and we were with him when he died in June 1993. His funeral was a celebration of his life and achievements. His mother, sisters, and brother, the same brother who had threatened Angus in 1971, had only learned of his AIDS diagnosis a month before and had dashed down to see him, just in time. They were now among the mourners, alongside his friends and colleagues. In death, there was some sort of reconciliation. At the service, I read W.H. Auden's lullaby, Lay Your Sleeping Head, My Love, which had been among my favourite poems since school days, and which Angus had asked me to read at Jeff's funeral 9 years before. For me, the poem celebrates the contingency and fragility of our lives, but also the transforming power of love. I felt I needed to read that passage to do honour and justice to a long relationship and to the experience of the HIV epidemic. Today, we've lived through a different sort of an epidemic, and it can't help but bring back thoughts and memories for people of my generation of what happened in the 1980s and 90s. And the thing that many things in common that are common to all epidemics, particularly the way in which epidemics somehow manage to always exploit the weaknesses and divisions of a culture. But of course, I can't help think that the stigma and shame that came to people living with HIV in the 80s and 90s was something unique and related to the toxic political culture of the time. So in celebrating the lives of people like Angus and many thousands of others, I think we're also condemning what still to me is a dark and evil period, which the more recent epidemic has not manifested, despite all the horrors we've experienced. And part of the reason for that is that things have changed. And the remarkable thing is the way in which the horrors, the homophobia, the transphobia, the biphobia of the 1970s, not words we used then, of the 1980s rather, not words we used then, but nevertheless deeply there, have shifted. And that's partly because one of the unexpected byproducts of the HIV epidemic, because out of that came forms of resistance, which I think have helped change medical practice, but also indirect and unexpected results. And I think the surge of energy that went into campaigns for same-sex marriage across the world indeed, but especially in America and Europe, stems from the experience of our epidemic, because it dramatized the fact that gay people were not recognized by the culture. It propelled a shift towards demands for full sexual citizenship. And one of the byproducts of that was something completely unexpected to my mind, although I was supposed to be a historian and a sociologist of sexuality and the gay experience, was a sudden interest in same-sex marriage. And I think it was precisely that link of the revealing of the way in which it was possible for people dying of HIV and AIDS to be denied recognition of their relationships by parents who took the body back, by the doctors and the hospitals, and the whole of the social services, certainly at the beginning of the epidemic. It wasn't the only thing. I think the other big push towards same-sex marriage came from the struggles of lesbian mothers for rights to their child, and for full recognition in the end of same-sex parenting. So I wanted to end really by saying something about same-sex marriage. I know it remains a divisive factor for many, and as I'll indicate in a moment, I had my own doubts about it. But nevertheless, what it does indicate is the fact of formal sexual citizenship, full citizenship between straights and gays, between diverse peoples. It's not the end of the story. Doesn't mean there aren't all sorts of divisions, all sorts of forms of oppression and exploitation. But at least we've now reached the stage of formal equality, which certainly when I was growing up in the valleys was impossible. So just a few things, just a final reading on same-sex marriage. I never thought I would marry. When I first came out, it was impossible anyway for me to marry another man. And unlike many early gay friends, I never contemplated marrying a woman as a cover of social necessity. As the years went by and I re-educated myself through the gay liberation movement and close contact with my feminist friends about the perils of family life, marriage seemed ideologically wrong and personally restrictive. Throughout the 1970s, I was involved in endless discussions about future possibilities, and I can't remember same-sex marriage being mentioned once as a desirable possibility. As arguments for same-sex marriage developed from the late 1980s, notably first in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries, the USA, Belgium, and the Netherlands, then across most gay-tolerant countries, I watched with interest as a historian and sociologist, but felt personally detached, very much like the people we interviewed for the book I did, Same-Sex Intimacies. Then the opportunity arose in Britain with the passing of the Civil Partnership Act, much sooner than I had anticipated. As I often say, historians are much better at forecasting the past than foretelling the future. How should Mark and I respond? By the time civil partnerships became available at the end of 2005, Mark and I had been together for 15 years. And if anything, our relationship had intensified over that time. Since 2003, we had at last started living together permanently. At the same time, Mark had given up his post as chief executive of a development trust down in Emily and worked from home. And this home became increasingly the basis for all our activities. Most parts of our lives were intricately and inextricably intertwined, and we survived. We debated for a long time whether we should formalize our relationship now that it was possible. Against was our strong feeling that we already had a strong commitment to each other and that we didn't need a legal contract. Related to this was a continuing anxiety that to in effect marry would entangle us in legal arrangements that we could all too easily simply echo traditional structures. We had built our own relationship against such structures and had no desire to replicate them. On the other hand, there were strong pragmatic reasons for going ahead. I was older than Mark. I was anxious that he should be recognized as my next of kin in the event of illness or early death. The AIDS crisis had underlined the necessity and justice of such considerations. There was also genuine material benefits to having a civil partnership, especially in relationship to pension and property rights. For all such reasons, as a friend said to me, we would be foolish not to take advantage of the opportunity. Transcending all these arguments was a more profound one. We now had the possibility of avowing our private commitment to each other in a public fashion, as heterosexual people had from time immemorial. Many people had fought long and hard for this right for same-sex couples, and we could not ignore it. Both of us had long committed to affirming openly our identities and sexualities. Whatever my initial doubts about same-sex marriage, I was now convinced there was not only an important act for individuals and couples, it was also an engine for changing the very nature and symbolism of marriage itself. no longer a sanctification of reproductive necessity, but increasingly a freely chosen act of commitment and love open to all sexualities and genders. It was a public recognition of privately made decisions. So we had a civil partnership. On the surface, nothing obvious had changed. Our new legal status did not alter our day-to-day relationship, yet we both felt everything was different. The pleasure our families on both sides took in the civil partnership was a sign of a wider recognition. As Mark's father wittily and characteristically said, once you were outlaws, now we are in-laws. Against all the odds, unexpectedly to many of us, civil partnerships and subsequently same-sex marriage have become a key staging post on the road to full and equal citizenship. Okay, that concludes the readings from the book. Have we got time for discussion?
Yes, I mean, if everyone's happy, I'm happy to stick around for a while and let this go on. It would seem a shame to stop it there. Alan?
It's fine with me, absolutely, Jeffrey. I've enjoyed so much listening to you read from the book, and having read myself or read the book myself, I can hear your voice as I'm reading. It really comes from the pages. But yes, maybe are there any thoughts or comments or questions from the audience?
There are. Sean has a question. So Sean, we'll come over to you first.
Yeah, well, it was a question. It's now a point, but I'll be brief. So during, like many people, I did a COVID clear out, and there's your book, Jeffrey, which was given to me just after I was elected president of my student union in 1977 to review for the student newspaper. And what it did was, it was very timely because we were having interesting debates with the Christian Union about the formation of a gay SOC and whether that was constitutional, etc. But what it did was, I think, gave a good basis for those debates, and it also gave a different dimension to being gay, which, you know, I love disco and fashion and, you know, partying and all the rest of it, but it just gave a more complete picture. It also enables me, because I was out at university, my friends say, isn't it about time you told your parents, because all these students know? And that was a direct result of that. So yeah, it's really not a question, it's a thank you. And I think a nice example of how being out in a certain community can give you that sort of support to manage that dialogue with family and parents as well. I think it's a really good point you made earlier. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan and Neil, for organising it.
Thank you. There are lots of comments in the chat box echoing those thank yous. So Paula says, I feel truly moved by this evening's event. Thank you, Jeffrey, for everything. I really enjoyed reading your book. Jeffrey, you're amazing. We have a lot to thank you for. So Alan, do you have questions? I'm sure you do.
Let me kind of compose myself a little bit. For me, the dominant theme for me is this idea of being able to see yourself and find yourself, and the book spoke to me in that way quite a lot. And tonight's talk has that same resonance. And you know, where you and I maybe have experiences that were, you know, of youth decades and continents apart, but there's so much similarity in the stories you tell, which for me speaks to some of the enduring power of sex and gender norms. But you spoke earlier about the first chapter being very difficult to write and taking a year, where the other 7 chapters then you wrote in 1 year. And do you want to maybe, not do you want to, could you maybe comment a little bit about how was this writing, how did it compare to the other writing you've done in your career, where it's quite intimate in places, isn't it?
Yes, I'm conscious that I'm a fluent writer in academic speak, and that's been learned over a long career. I've always tried to make my academic prose as readable and as personal as I could, but there are certain conventions of being an academic. In this book, I wanted to challenge myself to write something different, because it needs to be different, because this was me revealing things that outside my immediate friends and partner, people by and large didn't know about. So it was a challenge to get the tone right. The first paragraph, for instance, I must have rewritten 50 or 60 times. I just couldn't get the way in. And as always happens, it all came together at the last minute, that introduction. But I was also aware, and this was the more difficult thing, that what I was writing about was also something that my immediate family, meaning my blood family, and indeed Mark's family, didn't know about, wouldn't have known about. Because, you know, there are limits to intimacy, however close you are to them. You don't talk about your sex life. And here for the first time, I was talking about my sex life, my fumbling experiments, my first sexual encounters with people. At least one of my brothers knew, because we grew up in the same street with the same people. So this would have come as a shock to them. My mother and my father were both dead by this time, so I didn't have the embarrassment of having to reveal to them, but I certainly had to reveal to my brother and brothers and their families. So all these things were going through my mind. What's the right tone? What should I say? What shouldn't I say? And I really agonized over that. Wasn't out the first two chapters really, but I agonized over how to get it right. And in a sense, the way I got round it was to challenge myself by giving talks. So I gave 2 or 3 talks on that early stuff. One of them in Wales at the LGBT History Month thing. Twice, I think I gave talks there. And the other thing I did, which I don't normally do until I finished a book, is that I gave it to my partner, Mark, to read, which was a bit scary because in the past I've written something and then he's read it after it's published normally. But this time he had to read it, because in large part it's about him. Even when he's not present, it's about him, because it's written from the point of today when I'm with him. So it can't not be about him, as well as talking specifically about our relationship, which I've never done in print before. So for all those reasons, it was extremely challenging to get it right. But once I got that first chapter, and I say it took about a year, but I'd had chunks of it written out for talks. But once I got through that, in draft at least, I felt liberated to write the rest. And the rest was easier to write, not straightforwardly easy, because you had to exclude certain things, you had to make decisions about what to include. But nevertheless, it began to tell its own story. The writing began to speak to me, as well as me speaking to the writing. And I finished the book at the beginning of March last year, just as the new epidemic was closing everything down. I sent it off, I think, on the 16th of March, just a week before lockdown. So it was a product of the period before. But what, in a sense, gave me energy throughout the lockdown was the production process of, having it edited, copy edited, proofread, choosing the photographs. all of which gave a rhythm to the lockdown, luckily. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known what to do having finished the book. But the production of the book gave me a sense of direction during the lockdown.
Thank you. Louise, we have a question from you.
Yes, thank you. Earlier on, you said, amongst other things, it was a bit of a reconciliation with your writing. And I just wondered whether you feel you got that reconciliation through obviously your life experiences and also the actual writing of this book.
The essential, it's a very interesting question, because the emotional reconciliation in my life was, as I said, at both the civil partnership, which was a small affair, but also this big party, which was just a couple of months before for my 60th birthday, where all sides of my family, friends, colleagues were thrown together on a boat, actually. For the first time, people I thought would never ever meet, let alone have any meaningful contact with, were forced together. They did meet. And different generations, going from my mother in her late 80s to my niece then at 4 or 5, they were all there together. So that was a very important personal reconciliation for me. And their reaction to the civil partnership was, in a sense, confirming that from all sides. But in terms of my intellectual reconciliation, I think it was writing the book that did it, because all these you live experiences and you think that's wonderful, and then you go on to something else. Trying to put it all together through a lifetime, I think there is a sense of closure at the end of the book, which I don't want to spoil anyone who hasn't read it, but it ends with my mother's death and then the aftermath of that. It was a way of pulling everything together. My emotional experiences, my sexual experiences, my intellectual interests. I was able to pull them together at the end, at least to my satisfaction. And I did feel a sense of completion in doing that.
Thank you. We are going to, so I've popped a link to the book in there, and we're going to come to our last question, actually, from John. Bit of a nice plug for the book. How did you go about choosing the cover photo?
That's another interesting question. I didn't choose it, except in a generic sense. The publishers asked for a selection of photographs of me that they could put on the cover. So with Mark and I went through our collection, and his is much better than mine, certainly in digital form, and made a number of suggestions. I almost didn't put this in what I sent to the publisher, because this has been one of my least favorite photographs, strangely enough. And yet the publisher picked it out. It was Mark's selection as well. And they came back with a draft, exactly like this. The back was changed a little. So of the photographs, I don't know who did that on the front cover, but the back cover was a photo that that Mark took of me in Mexico. And the picture of me inside is by Mark as well. Now the one on the back, just to mention that, I think works quite well. You probably can't see it there, but it's of me in shadows, which is a staircase actually. But it seemed to be very apt for the idea of living between worlds and coming out of shadows and light and dark and so on. So I fell in love with that. But I'm very happy with the cover, and it's gone down much better than I anticipated. And I didn't have mascara on.
For those that weren't in the know, we were speaking about this before the event started. So that's all for questions. Jeffrey, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Alan for closing remarks.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for everything, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I've really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit more in the book through the pages, and tonight through the storytelling, and yes, I think tonight's event kind of cements your status as what was the quote? One of the most, or the most significant British intellectual working on sexuality to emerge from the radical sexual movement of the 70s. So thank you so much again for making tonight, I think, a huge success for everyone.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thank you all for making this such a pleasurable experience. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you. That's all I can say.
The book is fantastic, everyone. So Jeffrey, I hope it's a huge success. And Neil, for you to close us out.
Oh, well, firstly, Jeffrey, what a wonderful way to spend an evening with you all and listening to you. So thank you so much. I have popped some links into the rest of our Pride Month events. So do check those out. I'll be popping them in an email tomorrow. Jeffrey, look forward to hopefully working with you again soon. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Neil, for all
Bye.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.